Hello and welcome to the NextPowerUp review summary of Stellaris. This is a 4X title by Paradox Interactive, and this is a game that they've developed and sort of claimed the whole way through that this is going to be a nice new fresh approach to the 4X genre. Mainly because a lot of the sort of 4X games that have come out recently in the last few years, they've all been different in their setting, but for the most part a lot of the core features are very similar, and Stellaris does have a lot of sort of similarities to some of those older titles, but adds a whole lot of depth in different areas, and it just approaches different systems in a way that sort of not only makes sense, but just feels a little bit different, and you know, sets itself apart quite differently from other games in the same genre. The first thing in this game is the tutorial is not particularly fantastic. Even when you click on there's a few options: no tutorial, light tutorial, and like heavily detailed tutorial. And when I first started my first skirmish, because the game has no campaign, everything's done through skirmishes, like most 4X games, like Endless Legend, Civilization. It doesn't have that campaign like Anno does, for example. And the tutorial is kind of odd because you get dumped inside a game and then it'll come up with an initial tooltip box, and it will sort of explain a few things to you, and then it'll tell you to click on a few things. You know, for the first 10 minutes the tutorial makes sense and you think you're getting somewhere, but eventually it just sort of stops, because it tells you to do things that you can't necessarily do for a little while, and you've got to work your way to get there, and then there's just nothing. And by this point you've learned very little of the game's many systems, some of which are quite simplistic, some of which are very deep and quite complex as well. And so it kind of feels like you're sort of stopping and starting, and so the initial sort of wall of the game is quite prominent. So you jump into a game, your first skirmish you've got to set up the map and customize it how you like, which sort of makes sense, and it's quite nice to have that customization there. But you end up just randomly clicking on UI elements because you have no idea what they do, and then the game suddenly sparks up again and the tutorial guy starts telling you about all these things that you've just sort of clicked on by accident, and so it can get quite confusing. And as a result, the first skirmish you do is basically a write-off at this stage. I spent probably about 4 hours in the first skirmish, the first 2 hours at least learning how to play the game, and eventually getting to a stage where I thought I was ready, and then I found myself trapped in a little sector on the map because I hadn't learned about sort of territories yet, and how you can't travel between rival territories and all this crazy stuff, and the diplomacy thing didn't make any sense because I didn't understand what was going on, and there was just like a whole lot of stuff I didn't understand, and the game just sort of went, there you go, off you go, do what you like. And so as a result, I did do what I liked, did very poorly at it because I didn't understand most of it, and ended up just failing miserably. I didn't completely get wiped out, but it was at the stage where there was no point in carrying on, and with things I learned, I should have just started a new skirmish and sort of build from there, which is what I did. And, you know, then it sort of took off and the gameplay made sense and everything started to come together, and I'd learnt a few things, and just everything. There seems to be like this critical point in the game, like a few hours after the tutorial and after your first brutal failure, when the game just sort of makes sense and everything comes together. And I think a large portion of it is just from the offset knowing what you intend to do, and it's sort of probably based around building out your territories and making outposts and inhabiting planets and just general stuff like that you wouldn't have necessarily learnt too quickly or wouldn't have a full understanding of, particularly in things you may not have done in that space of time. I know in the first game I played, the first portion of the game, I hadn't experienced a lot of the elements in the game, like landing armies on enemy planets and stuff like that. So yeah, the tutorial is a little bit lacking. It's very erratic and it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. And it's more, I guess the game is more of the mind that you should sort of explore the aspects of it and sort of just work your way around, except as a brand new player. If you were someone that had never played 4Xs before, I played Master of Orion and all sorts of old school stuff, including all the modern things. But even I found it slightly challenging on the offset just to get somewhere, basically. So the tutorial could definitely use a little bit of work. And, you know, your first 3 or 4 hours are kind of pointless. You may as well spend a day doing a skirmish, learning the game, and then just deleting it and starting again. Now that you've learned how to do everything. For the most part, it is quite a refreshing 4X title, to be perfectly honest. I haven't mentioned many of the systems yet, but they seem to do this really great thing where they take a lot of the basic stuff from a lot of 4X titles, a lot of strategy titles, where you have all these different types of resources and materials and ways you've got to get things. Like in Endless Legend, there's multiple kinds of resources that you've got to earn in order to make advanced materials. And for the most part, the game sort of just simplifies that and ignores it. There are the occasional sort of teaser of rare materials here and there, but they're not bam in the gameplay straight away, and you've got to search the map across to find them all. You can make your way through a fair portion of a skirmish without ever coming across that sort of aspect of the gameplay. Planet management, landing armies, managing, upgrading ships. There's so much that there's just not enough time for me to cover it all, because this game has an insane amount of systems. You've got governors for planets, you've got leaders for armies, you've got leaders for naval fleets. You can go out and explore different territories. You can do all this diplomacy stuff. Everything. It's all just, there's so much, except it's really well sort of implemented. There are a couple of systems which, they've simplified, which I feel like they may have sort of oversimplified a little bit too much, in my opinion. Particularly combat, in that it comes down to a rock paper scissors thing. You take your fleet, you put it against another fleet. If you have a higher combat effectiveness than them, then you win, unless of course they're using a certain type of shielding which negates a little bit of damage from your weapons, or if they're using weapons that negate your armor or something like that. And it's very much a rock paper scissors thing, and you just attack, click, and just watch it happen. So that bit is a little bit too oversimplified, but that aspect also comes in the form of war, because war isn't just won in this game by simply annihilating your opponent. You can you wage war against the opponent, you demand what you want from the war before you start it. And then you you do these little combat skirmishes, and you do tactical strikes, invade a couple of planets. And once you fill this bar, which is similar to the combat bar, once it fills, you've officially won the war, even if you haven't destroyed them, which is actually kind of cool. That's how real live wars work. You don't just completely annihilate an entire continent and then declare yourself the winner. Sometimes they can say, okay, you know what, take this territory, whatever, you win. So that's actually pretty cool. The really cool thing about this game is it does definitely remind me of the old Master of Orion days, in that skirmishes will last days, literal in real life days. I remember playing Master of Orion 2, and one particular skirmish must have lasted me about 2 weeks, just because the game is massive and there are so many systems. Some of the systems are incredibly deep and complex, and there's just so much for you to explore. Even when you customize the game and set the galaxy to small, which is not small in the slightest, the skirmishes can last ages, which for most 4X players, that's pretty cool. That's what they want. I guess for the more casual players, that's a little bit too much time to invest for not necessarily a whole lot of reward throughout. But for the most part, I imagine a lot of 4X players will be delighted about that fact, because it's taken them back to the good old days before, games were over quite quickly. But without this sort of turn-based format, it goes on for quite a while. The research systems are actually pretty cool, which I've noticed a lot of reviewers have picked up on. And this is quite interesting, because instead of having tons of resources, you only have two, which is your energy and your sort of credits, I guess. Your main currency, which is these red crystals. But you can also mine research points. And there's 3 different types of research, and you can mine those different types. You've got like worldwide research, physics, and biology, I think. And you can mine those on your planets from... if you've inhabited them, from your little tiles, or you can mine them from random planets in sectors you own near your outposts, which is also quite cool. An interesting way of dealing with that research sort of resource system, instead of just amassing scientists or whatever. And what's most interesting is you can sort of hire scientists to head each of the 3 main aspects of research, and they'll each have their specialty. So one might increase the speed of sort of research on military weapons or something like that, or one will just have a blanket increase to all research. Except what's most interesting is if a scientist has like a specialization, like in military weapons, if you place him in the physics slot, they will actually increase the chance of you getting a research module for that slot, which relates to their speciality, which is kind of a nice way for a player to not just have to figure out what this massive talent tree global thing is and what the prerequisites are to get other things, because it then gives you a chance to get something that you probably want, and so you can sort of juggle around your scientists and research in that sort of form, I guess, which is a nice way of approaching it, and it adds less of a randomness to the aspect of the game. But on sort of the subject of randomness, there are an awful lot of random events across the place. Like, you'll come across random aliens. One thing I found quite cool was I actually came across our solar system. with Mercury, Venus, Mars, and everything. They weren't named that, but I knew it as soon as I got there. And I found a planet, which was Earth, and it had the ISS floating around it. And I managed to, you sort of come across these random alien races that aren't necessarily spacefaring, so they're just sort of, they're treated as lower life forms, I guess. And you can either completely annihilate them and just take over the planet, or what I found quite cool is you can build this like listening post, I guess, and learn about them, and you can then spend some of your influence points every month in order to sort of infiltrate their political system and their military leaders and everything, and eventually overthrow the planet, take it over, and then enslave them all, or sort of integrate them into your society. And there's also like a heavy element of integration, so you can get all sorts of aliens transferred and living amongst each other in these different planets, and then that brings up like more things, like they then want to go independent of your little faction, and you have to manage. There's just tons of stuff to manage. Like, the game does have like this fast forward and slow down and pause aspect, but I found myself very rarely using them, because sort of after the first 2 hours, when you're sort of really getting yourself set up, there's really no need to fast forward the game. I actually found myself always constantly needing to do something, and fast forwarding was actually a bit of a worry, because it meant I might miss some things. And there's just tons of random events. There's just masses and masses and masses of random stuff. The maps are massive, the galaxies are huge, and so yeah, there's just a lot of content, and a lot of it's quite mixed. The other aspect of this game is, yes, it does simplify a lot of systems, but it makes other systems more complex, like, as I mentioned, with the sort of taking over planets and people wanting to split off into independence. However, other systems have been made a little too simplistic. Like I mentioned, the combat is a little bit basic for my tastes, I guess. It's just sort of like a beat your head against something until it works. And also the diplomacy system felt a little bit too simplistic. Because I couldn't really get my head around this diplomacy system, because it didn't do things I wanted it to do necessarily. Like, when you wage a war against someone, you can't just say, you know what, I surrender. That just doesn't work. There is no option for that. And I found myself sort of trying to make these diplomatic sort of things in the UI, and it wasn't really working. And I remember in one stage I had so many energy credits, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to dump a ton of them on some alien race to improve my standing with them, and then maybe they'll give me passage through their territory, either just civilian or military as well, so I could go to other enemies and attack them and sort of strike their planets and take over them. Except I found myself sort of dumping masses and masses and masses of things into the trading panel, and asking for one small thing in return, and they would just say no. Flat out no. And it just felt like the diplomacy system is really quite unbalanced and a bit too simplified, and it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I didn't really get what I wanted out of the diplomacy system. I know a lot of games have diplomacy systems, and they all feel quite bad, to be perfectly honest, and no game has really got it particularly well done. And I have to be honest, Stellaris hasn't done it fantastically either. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but it just didn't feel like how it should, I guess, and it was just too simplified, and there weren't enough options for the things that I wanted to do. So I have to say I wasn't a huge fan of that. In terms of the UI, it's actually pretty good, because a lot of this stuff has been simplified in such a manner. The UI actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, when you first start the game, as I said in the tutorial, it's like, whoa, this stuff is crazy, I don't understand any of it. But for the most part, once you do get your head around things and get over that initial speed bump, the UI just sort of makes sense. And for the most part, the game can be played with just the mouse. But you can like zoom out and get into the map and move across. And once you've learnt double clicks and how you can track and monitor things, like it all just feels seamless, and it all just sort of comes together, and it actually feels quite nice. Unfortunately, the video options are terrifically bad. It does support 4K, but there is a 60 FPS cap, which is becoming more and more common these days, and it's absolutely infuriating. And I get this feeling that eventually my FPS chart is just going to have 60 written all over it, because every game seems to be capped at that for some reason. For what reasons, I have no idea, but it's kind of annoying. I mean, I know there's not that many people running 144Hz monitors, but it's still a little bit irritating. So yeah, I don't get it, and it's just been a massive irritation for a very long time in a lot of different games. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of simplification and complexity, I guess. And I think that's one of the key aspects which I wasn't too certain on. But for the most part, this definitely feels like a much better 4X title than a lot of the games out there that we've seen. So for sure, I mean, it's quite... I wouldn't say it's fair to necessarily compare it to a lot of 4X titles directly, but it has done a lot of things well, and it's approached things from a different angle, and it's just made them feel a lot more easy to approach and deep, I guess. Deep, but not too crazy. I suppose that the main factor of this game is whether or not you're willing to spend a couple of hours a day for several days in order for a skirmish to sort of be over and advance in the way you want. For the most part, it is a fantastic 4X game. Like, it has done a lot of things right, and very few things sort of poorly, I guess. But for the most part, I quite like the game. I would probably end up carrying on playing it for another few weeks, I think, because I'm not quite finished yet. And I failed catastrophically, and you'll probably see in the video that's playing over this at the moment, I believe I'm getting absolutely annihilated by someone I waged war against, thinking I had a superior naval fleet, and I was very, very, very wrong. So yeah, if you've got the time for this, and if you're like a proper 4X fan, then this is definitely going to be one of the best 4X games that has come out in recent history. It's just, the more casual players who don't necessarily want to spend entire weeks finishing a skirmish, or for those that would be put off by like a 2 to 3 hour learning curve in order to really get to grips with the game. I know a lot of games out there have better tutorials, and they just feel a little bit more approachable. And yes, they do certain things wrong that Stellaris does right, but at the same time, that's not going to matter to a lot of prospective buyers, because if they're sort of playing the game initially and they can play it, then, they're not necessarily going to mind some of the shortcomings later. However, if you are sort of coming to 4X at first and you've never played one before, then this is definitely not the easiest one to approach by a long shot. But for the most part, I would definitely recommend this to most 4X people. I know Beyond Earth was okay, but it was a little bit of a disappointment, and again, it had pretty poor diplomacy options. But this just feels a lot better than it has been. There's just a few kinks that they definitely need to work out. And of course, it's fantastic because it has like near infinite mod support, which is pretty awesome, to be perfectly honest. And we don't really see an awful lot of that these days. So yeah, I think Paradox have definitely got themselves a top tier 4X game on their hands, and I have a very good feeling that they're probably going to take a lot of business away from a lot of 4X developers, like with the endless stuff, particularly from Sid Meier, because I think that Civilization is definitely has a lot of games that are hot on their toes right now, and they need to sort of buck up their ideas and really get their next game right, if indeed there is another game. So yeah, Stellaris, pretty damn good game, looks pretty, performs pretty well as well. Just a shame about that 60 FPS cap. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this review. Next week, I believe we'll be reviewing Shadowrun, which is pretty cool. I haven't got my key yet, so I haven't had a chance to quickly dive into that. But yeah, that should be up next Thursday. And we'll see you guys on Saturday for our next week in gaming. So yeah, see you guys this weekend.